143, written by Jade Winters, narrated by Ella McCready. Chapter 1. The 10th floor of the Parliament View apartment block overlooked the City of London. The living room's floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the River Thames, upon which the illuminated Houses of Parliament sat, highlighting its striking architecture. Like most days, Rebecca awoke ahead of her 5:30 a.m. alarm call and stood at the window of her apartment, watching London come alive. It was hard not to be in awe of the city from this angle. Most people only saw London from the ground upwards. She loved the beauty and history that epitomized the city. For a few more moments she watched the road below her, alive with braided strands of traffic, then walked back over to the bed and gently lowered herself down, being careful not to wake its sleeping occupant. Rebecca never tired of looking at Genevieve while she slept. Every morning she drank in the beautiful oval-shaped face framed with blonde, highlighted dark brown hair, the barely noticeable little scar above her top lip, the result of a childhood accident, and the small mole on her right cheek that only enhanced her beauty. Genevieve stirred and opened her sleepy eyes. "Hey you," she said, a broad, lazy grin lighting up her face. "Hey yourself," Rebecca replied with a smile, leaning over and covering Genevieve's face with little kisses before drawing back to look directly into deep green eyes. "I love you." "How much?" Genevieve looked mischievous. "I can't quite think of a word that describes it accurately." "So I'll never know." "Oh, I think I can find another way until a word comes to mind," Rebecca said as they dived under the quilt laughing. Much later they lay breathless, their bodies entwined with one another, not speaking, just being. Their love-making had always evoked a form of contentment. They had not been cursed with the dreaded lesbian bed death that a lot of their lesbian friends had been through. They were attracted to each other now as much as they had been when they first met. Though it was not with the same urgency, their love-making was still intense. Genevieve was the first one to reluctantly move out of their embrace. "Why do we always end up having sex before we go to work? It just makes me want to stay in bed with you all day." She sat up looking down at Rebecca, who was now stretching on her back. "But just think, we have the whole weekend to do nothing but please ourselves, and each other," Rebecca said languorously, winking at Genevieve. "Now please cover that body before we really do end up not leaving the bed." With both women finally dressed and at the kitchen table eating breakfast, the subject of the evening's event arose. "Are you sure you don't mind me going to Paul's show tonight?" Genevieve said, as she sipped her freshly squeezed orange juice. "Positive," Rebecca replied, with more conviction than she felt. "What's he going to do? Ravish you over his paintings? Come to think of it, I wouldn't put it past him." She popped the last remains of her croissant in her mouth and rose quickly, starting to clear the table. Genevieve smiled. "You know something? I think I want to marry you," she said, changing the subject. She decided it might be better if, for now at least, she avoided the issue of Paul's sudden invitation for her to attend his show that evening. "Let's not even go there with that one," Rebecca said, leaning over and dropping a kiss on Genevieve's forehead. She loaded the dishwasher and turned to see Genevieve looking at her with mock surprise. "What?" she asked innocently, stifling a smile as she imagined walking down the aisle with Genevieve. Rebecca and Genevieve often spoke about a civil partnership, but neither of them could seriously go through with it. They had both agreed they would die of embarrassment, so it was better to stay as they were. Their property was to be left to the surviving partner, so as far as they were concerned, they had the important areas covered, and they didn't need to publicly declare their love for each other to know they were committed for life. Rebecca had all she wanted: a woman that she loved more than life itself, and a job as a freelance art critic, which had been more of a passion than a career for the past 6 years. According to Rebecca, art critics fell into different groups. There were the highbrow critics who wrote for art journals, and whose targeted audience was assumed to be quite knowledgeable about the arts, and understood the everyday jargon that was used. Then there were those who wrote for the daily or weekly newspapers, whose targeted audience didn't know their arse from their elbow, and thus the critic wrote in a more informal way, telling the masses of their subjective view on the piece they were writing about. Rebecca, on the other hand, was more interested in informing the public of what the artist was trying to get across, rather than give her own subjective views. It was because of this that she was one of London's most successful art critics. Her rise to the top had come via a route not dissimilar to others who had managed to get a foot in the door. After studying for a degree in art and literature, she had worked briefly at an art gallery. It was here that she began writing for a monthly art magazine, submitting her reviews on openings she had attended. It had been the editor of the magazine, with whom she had had a brief affair, who'd brought her attention to an opening for a new prestigious art magazine. She'd forwarded her art review clippings and gotten the job. For the past 6 years she'd been working as a freelancer, giving critical opinions on works of art, galleries, and artists. She had a loyal following that respected her opinions, and as such she played a vital role in an emerging artist's career. Though the role of cultural gatekeeper had been unwittingly bestowed upon her, she was uncomfortable in it, and tried her best to remember that she served the people, and doing her job well meant introducing the public to an array of art that would enlighten everyone. Aside from her work, life for Rebecca had been truly uneventful until she'd met Genevieve. Not that she had anything to complain about. The past 30 years had been good to her, but Rebecca could never have envisioned that she would feel this way about someone. When she'd met Genevieve, it was as if her soul knew the search was over. It was like coming home from a long journey and finally sleeping in your own bed. It was this kind of warmth and security that she always felt with Genevieve, and her life had been enriched in a way she never thought possible. Her most prized piece of art was a portrait Genevieve had given to her. Not only was the painting breathtaking, it was also how Genevieve had first told Rebecca that she loved her. Although Rebecca did not wear a necklace, Genevieve had painted one on Rebecca's neck, with the numbers 143 dangling from it. At first she couldn't comprehend the symbolic significance of the numbers, but then with sudden clarity the meaning had become obvious. Each number stood for the number of letters in the words, "I love you." Rebecca had had relationships in the past, but they were neither great nor bad. If she had to sum them up, they would come under the term flatliners. No ups or downs, no emotional pull either way. It wasn't because she was holding herself back either. She liked to think of herself as being quite fluid. She just went where her emotions took her. In the last 4 years, though, she'd experienced depths of emotion that she'd previously thought inconceivable. It was 9 a.m. when Rebecca and Genevieve finally strode through the lobby of their apartment block. Acknowledging the chorus of good mornings from neighbours, they made their way out of the building. The mild heat of spring lay over the city, the sky was a golden yellow, and buds were alive and blossoming, relieving branches and stems of their solitude. The buzzing bees were a welcome signal of the new season now upon them. The scent of spring, the smell of new beginnings, Rebecca thought to herself. "I'll see you tonight," she said, letting her hand fall into Genevieve's. They kissed each other on the cheek. Rebecca's driver was already parked outside in a black polished Mercedes. "Good morning, ladies," Peter said through the open window of the car. "Yes, it is," they said in unison, and laughed. Genevieve brought her eyes up to meet Rebecca's. "I really love you," she said, with such intensity that Rebecca felt a bit unnerved. "Are you planning on making a confession of some sort, or are you going to do a runner?" Rebecca asked, half-jokingly. "Neither," Genevieve smiled. "I can't explain why, but it's just important that you know. I'm just being silly. Go on, go, before you're late." "I'm going through Westminster. Would you like a lift?" "No, I think I'll walk." And with that, Genevieve was gone. Reluctantly, Rebecca got into the car. Even as Peter took off, she was unable to shake the disturbing tinge of uneasiness. Sometimes life just potters along merrily. Nothing much really happens, and days go by, with weekends providing a welcome break from the usual routine. At other times, an event happens, and a small pebble is thrown into the pool of life. It makes a few ripples that momentarily upset the balance, but then the surface soon calms, and normality is restored. And occasionally there comes a time when a large rock is hurled into the pool, creating a tidal wave of havoc and flooding that causes so much damage that the effects are seemingly endless. Chapter 2. 4 years earlier. The Ivy House Gallery in South London was hosting a show in aid of Children South East, a charity which had been set up with the aim of turning troubled teenagers' lives around. Rebecca had been invited to write a review for an artist who was showing her work for the first time, as well as shedding light on the need to help raise funds for such a worthwhile cause. She'd heard good things about the artist through the grapevine, and was interested in meeting her in person, as well as seeing her new work. Guests at the black tie event were met with a champagne reception, including a wide range of canapés created by the Ivy House's award-winning chef. With glass in hand and sipping her champagne slowly, Rebecca moved through the crowd until she spotted the artist. There was no mistaking her. Her tall, sculpted body covered by a black, tight-fitting strapless dress served to accentuate the firmness of her body. Long hair rested on her bare, tanned shoulders, her cheeks were radiant, and an enigmatic smile exuded an undeniable confidence. Standing in the middle of a group of people, she looked like royalty holding court. There was a humour in her voice while she talked about the graffiti artist, Banksy. Rebecca caught the sound of Genevieve's voice in the midst of saying, "The problem, and what people can't get their heads around, is that his stance was always anti-establishment and anti-capitalism, but now his work goes for a fortune and he's being exhibited in Knightsbridge." "But," Rebecca said, moving into the group to stand squarely in front of her, "to be an artist you have to make art, and to make a living out of that art you have to sell your work. Isn't it a privilege to make money doing something you truly love, or are artists exempt from needing money? I think there's a distinction between selling out and selling. I don't think you can be accused of selling out unless you change your work to cave in to commercial pressures, or prostitute yourself for the advertising pound, and he's never done that." There was an instant spark in Genevieve's eyes as they met with Rebecca's. She drank in Rebecca's features, the way her face was framed in long, tousled curls of ebony, which perfectly complemented her subtle olive skin tone. Her piercing eyes, with the teasing hint of grey, held a distant, dreamy look, and her figure was slender and taut. But it was those lips, those full and sensuous lips, that almost tipped Genevieve over the edge. For what seemed like an age, she forgot to breathe. She didn't know why she was suddenly speechless. The silence continued as the two women stood there, frozen in time, looking into each other's eyes. The surrounding group eventually dispersed, muttering polite pleasantries about her work, and went to either look at the art or refill their drinks. Genevieve finally found her voice to break the silence. "And you are?" she asked, holding out her hand. "Rebecca." Genevieve took her hand with the intention of shaking it, but just held it. Not quite long enough for onlookers to notice that something was happening between the two women, but just long enough for Rebecca to acknowledge that Cupid had stung them both with a sweet, sharp, and deadly arrow. Both women strolled close together while Genevieve pointed out her work. Her creations came under the banner of fine art photography, which referred to photographs that were taken to fulfill the creative vision of the artist. Looking at the images Genevieve had captured, Rebecca knew this project was not just another assignment. It came from a place deep within the woman. Some artists provide art for others to enjoy. Genevieve's art was to provide the viewer with an experience that they themselves would never experience. Her photography was about real life. The emotions, which were captured at the very moment the lenses closed, remained, and if you looked at the images for too long, you would feel immersed in them. Genevieve was against the recent trend of careful staging and lighting of pictures. Her images were discovered instead of ready-made. Rebecca saw in Genevieve a raw and unique talent that she hadn't seen in a very long time. "There you are, darling," a male voice sounded from behind them. He slid his arm around Genevieve's waist and pulled her closer to him, so her body slotted neatly into his. He kissed her briefly on the mouth, before she managed to disentangle herself from him. Extending her hand out to Rebecca, she made the introductions. "Paul, Rebecca, Rebecca, Paul." Paul used his free hand to give Rebecca a firm handshake. "Nice to meet you. I've heard lots about you. It's nice to finally be able to put a face to the name." Turning his attention back to Genevieve, he said, "I'm going to have to steal you for a while, darling. Everyone wants to know the date you're going to make an honest man out of me." Rebecca felt an instant tightening in her chest and had to force herself to remain calm, put a wide smile on her face, and say to Genevieve, "Well, it was an honour to have finally met you and to have seen your work." "I look forward to seeing what you write about me," Genevieve said, with a flirtatious smile that only Rebecca could see, and with that she turned round and followed Paul into the crowd. Rebecca watched as she walked away so gracefully. She appeared to float through the gathered guests, seemingly unaware of the effect her presence had on those around her, as she headed for a waiter and lifted a glass of champagne from the tray. The night was a great success, with over £100,000 being raised for the charity, and Rebecca had seen more than enough to write an in-depth piece about Genevieve's art and the charity itself. She hadn't had the opportunity to talk with Genevieve again, but there had been eye contact when they were within each other's radar. To their mutual regret, both critic and artist had been swamped with guests wanting to talk to them. Rebecca's car was waiting outside the building. She had chosen not to learn how to drive because she enjoyed her social life and didn't want to get bogged down with all the hassles that go with driving, namely being breathalyzed. Peter, her driver, had the passenger door open, a gesture he knew she hated, but he did it anyway. He'd been assigned as her driver when she had done a 2-month stint at Cadie's art magazine, because she worked late most nights. Peter was 65 when he was given a brief handshake and pensioned off as a driver for the magazine. On his last day, he'd informed Rebecca that he was not looking forward to having no work. She had grown to like him over the months and found him a pleasure to be around. He was kind, intelligent, capable, and most importantly had an easy-going nature. She had offered him a job, and Peter had accepted the position for a fixed rate per week, and said he didn't mind working some nights either, which was an added bonus. He was a widower, and appeared to be remarkably unaware of the attraction he held for women, generally spending his evenings in front of the TV. He was a tall, compact, rugged-looking man, who had a powerful, resilient look about him. His thick silver hair served to complement his strong facial features, giving him the look of someone 10 years younger. His soft hazel eyes could melt the hardest of hearts, and in Rebecca's opinion he was just what any ready-to-date widow could hope for. He gave her a little chuckle when he saw the annoyed look on her face this particular night. He played the chauffeur role to a T, and quite enjoyed treating her like she was a lady, even though it pissed her off a little. She was the best thing that had happened to him since his wife had passed away several years ago. He knew Rebecca had given him the job through kindness, not pity, and he respected her for that. She treated him as an equal, and had never talked down to him or belittled him. He was just about to close the door after Rebecca had settled in, when he saw a woman emerging from the arts building and heading straight for his car. She bent her head inside the car door. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. Rebecca slid over to the other side of the seat and indicated for her to get in. She felt perplexed by the unexpected appearance of Genevieve, and fought to suppress her mixed emotions of desire and fear, feeling relieved when Peter closed the car door and the vehicle's interior was finally shrouded in darkness. Glancing at Peter as he sat in the driver's seat, Genevieve leaned over and whispered in Rebecca's ear, "Shall we go somewhere more private?" "Take me home, please," Rebecca said to Peter as he put his seatbelt on. They had driven the short journey back to Rebecca's flat in silence, both aware of the built-up tension between them, but not knowing what to say. Peter stopped the car outside her apartment block, and this time made no attempt to open the door for her. They both bade him good night and made their way into the building. The middle-aged concierge, who looked like a Neanderthal someone had stuffed into a suit, looked up from the computer screen with flat, unsmiling eyes. "Good evening," he said, then promptly returned to reading the football results before he even acknowledged their reply. The two women made their way up to the 10th floor, and for the first time since they had been in the car, the close proximity of the lift forced them to look at each other. Their eyes blazed with the knowledge that they were heading to the point of no return. With the build-up of nerves and tension, Both women were relieved when the lift reached Rebecca's floor. Inside the apartment, Genevieve expressed her appreciation of the flat. "Drink?" Rebecca asked. Genevieve nodded her head. "Please." She walked over to the window to look at the London skyline. "Wow, this is a great view to photograph." Rebecca brought the drinks over and handed one to her. They stood there for several minutes, close but not talking, just looking at the view, sipping their drinks now and then. Without looking at her, Rebecca spoke first. "So, you're engaged?" "In a way. Look, I'm going to be honest with you," Genevieve replied slowly, as she returned to face Rebecca. Her lips spoke in a calm manner, but her stomach was doing somersaults. "I don't know what happened back there. Hell, I don't even know what's happening now, but I just need to see this through, to see where this will go." They both knew they were plunging into something far more entangling than a casual liaison, but the words to clarify this remained unspoken. It was several seconds before Rebecca found her voice. "I forgot to bring the bottle of wine out with me. Make yourself comfortable," she said shakily as she quickly left the room. She stood in the kitchen, her heart pounding. Normally poised and confident, she felt like a teenager on her first date. When her heart had finally resumed something of its normal rhythm, she returned to the front room with the wine and found that Genevieve was no longer there. She put the bottle on the table and went in search of her. Genevieve was in the bedroom, lying in the bed with her clothes strewn on the floor. Genevieve stretched out her arm. "Come and keep me warm. I'm cold." She said it so softly it was almost like a physical caress. Rebecca approached the bed slowly, her heart thumping so hard she wondered if Genevieve could hear it. Her magnetism was irresistible, and Rebecca was powerless in the face of it. When Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed, Genevieve moved over towards her, the sheets slipping away from her body, exposing her small, firm breasts. She gently stroked Rebecca's cheek with the back of her hand, while a small reassuring smile curved about her lips. When she felt Rebecca relax, she leaned over and kissed her gently on the lips. Sensing no resistance, she let her tongue find its way into Rebecca's mouth, kissing her deeply, their tongues dancing sensually together. As she began to unbutton Rebecca's blouse, a faint gasp involuntarily escaped her lips when she realized Rebecca wasn't wearing a bra. Her skin felt firm and silky to the touch. The effect of being so intimate with Genevieve made Rebecca's head begin to spin. Her body was reacting in a way that was alien to her. She could actually feel the sexual energy exploding from her insides. With her silk blouse now discarded on the floor, Rebecca stood up and removed the rest of her clothing, aware that Genevieve didn't once take her eyes off her, watching her with pure lust. Genevieve lifted back the sheet so Rebecca could get in beside her. At once their bodies fixed together like parts of a puzzle. Rebecca placed her mouth over Genevieve's breast while searching for her place of excitement, caressing the inside of her thighs until she exploded with pleasure. Their lips found each other's once again with a slow and intimate kiss. Clinging tightly together, it was now Genevieve's turn to find the place that made Rebecca shudder with delight. Lying in bed, snuggled closely together, Rebecca said laughingly, "Now the pleasantries are over, we can get to know each other." "Oh, so soon?" Genevieve said, kissing her again and stroking her body, revelling in the sensuous feel of Rebecca's nakedness. "I do believe there is a certain issue of a male, a fiancé, and you making said person an honest man," Rebecca reminded her. Genevieve flopped back on the puffed-up pillows and took the glass of wine Rebecca offered her. "It's a long story," she said, her eyes becoming darker. "Well, it's Saturday tomorrow and I have no plans, so I've got all night for this story. Are you hungry?" she asked, attempting to get out of bed. "Yes," Genevieve said, pulling her back down, "but not for food." Lying in bed, snuggled closely together, Rebecca said laughingly, "Now the pleasantries are over, we can get to know each other." "Oh, so soon?" Genevieve said, kissing her again and stroking her body, revelling in the sensuous feel of Rebecca's nakedness. "I do believe there is a certain issue of a male, A fiancé, and you making said person an honest man? Rebecca reminded her. Genevieve flopped back on the puffed-up pillows and took the glass of wine Rebecca offered her. It's a long story, she said, her eyes becoming darker. Well, it's Saturday tomorrow and I have no plans, so I've got all night for this story. Are you hungry? She asked, attempting to get out of bed. Yes, Genevieve said, pulling her back down, but not for food. Chapter 3. Present Day. An unearthly chill ran through Rebecca's body as she listened to her voicemail. The background noise of music and traffic muted, and movement paused as if time itself did not dare continue its incessant journey. An unrecognizable voice was still talking in her earpiece. Rebecca was having difficulty hearing what was being said. She had only heard the first few words when her world had stopped. Rebecca sat frozen in her seat. She wanted to tear a hole in the world and escape through it. Peter, sensing something was wrong, pulled the car over to the curb and turned around to see Rebecca looking very pale, the blood drained from her face. Her hand was trembling, gripping the side of the door handle. Her brain started to function again, reluctantly replaying what she had heard. Hospital, Genevieve Simmons, accident, next of kin. We need to get to St. Thomas's Hospital now, Rebecca barked. Peter didn't need any further instructions. He floored the accelerator and swung back into the traffic, racing toward the hospital. Running through the doors of the hospital's A&E department, tears came to her eyes, magnifying and distorting the scene into a hazy blur. She just about made out where the receptionist's desk was and approached it, trying to maintain some composure. Rebecca was not normally a dramatist, but hospitals gave her a sense of dread. It had been 6 years since she'd last entered one, when she had faced the trauma of losing both her parents in a car accident. As an only child, she'd had to bear the brunt of her loss alone. At reception, she was told Genevieve had been moved to the intensive care unit and given directions. In different circumstances, she would have humorously asked her for a sat-nav to help her find her way. The hospital was like a maze. Corridors led on to more corridors, and all seemed to blend into one another. Finally, she found the ward's blue sign above the door, intensive care. They were just harmless words, 2 innocent words, but they implied so much. The adrenaline was still firing in her body, but her mind had slowed down. Part of her wanted to swing back the doors and rush headlong into the ward, and another just couldn't bear to face what lay ahead. She hesitantly opened the door and stepped into the lobby area. There was another set of doors, which were locked. She looked frantically around her for some way of getting in. Then she noticed the small bell that visitors were meant to press to announce their arrival. A faint voice greeted her over the intercom. "Hello? I'm here for Genevieve Simmons. Genevieve Simmons?" Rebecca nearly screamed. "One moment, please," the anonymous voice replied. Rebecca's heart was in her stomach. Her hands shook and she had to will herself to breathe. The door opened a fraction and a doctor slid through, careful not to expose the ward behind her. The doctor's thinness caught her eye, and for a bizarre instant she wondered if she had been helping herself to the pharmaceutical supply. "I believe Genevieve Simmons was brought to this ward today," Rebecca said, exasperated. "Are you related?" the doctor asked. Rebecca shook her head, and for the first time tears started to well up in her eyes. "No, I'm not." She looked down towards the floor. Crying in front of people, especially strangers, was not something she normally did. "I'm sorry, but due to the serious nature of the injuries, I'm not supposed to discuss the patient with anyone but family." Rebecca could not take in what she had just been told. The doctor wasn't supposed to tell her because she wasn't related. Rebecca looked at her incredulously. "You're not allowed to discuss her condition with me because I'm not her fucking family. How dare you? How fucking dare you treat me like this, like I'm nothing?" she shouted at the top of her voice. The sound of the commotion brought a nurse poking her head through the door. She quickly assessed the situation and asked if she should call security. "She's my partner! You called me!" Rebecca broke down completely. The doctor quickly looked through her notes and then gently took Rebecca by the arm and led her into the waiting room adjacent to the ward. They both sat down on what looked like relatively new chairs. "You are right, I am sorry. She had a next of kin card and we have been trying to contact you all day. When we couldn't reach you, we managed to track down her parents. They should be arriving shortly. I've had my phone off as I've been in a meeting all day. Please tell me how she is." The look on the doctor's face made Rebecca brace herself for the worst. She held her breath. "I'm afraid she was attacked, and as a result has suffered trauma to her head. Genevieve is still alive," the doctor said, responding to Rebecca's stricken face. "But she's in a coma. She can't respond to any stimuli such as pain or the sound of a voice or perform any voluntary actions. The brain is still functioning, but at its most basic level." The walls began to close in on Rebecca. How can this be happening? Genevieve, who'd responded to her lovemaking this morning, both laughing like schoolgirls in the shower, feeding each other breakfast, and now she was in a coma. How can that be? The doctor was still talking, and Rebecca tried her hardest to concentrate. "There is no single treatment that can cause someone to come out of a coma. However, treatments can prevent further physical and neurological damage." "I want to see her," Rebecca said, standing up unsteadily. "Please let me see her." The doctor rose with her and put a hand on her arm, although whether to comfort or steady her, Rebecca didn't know. "Genevieve has a lot of machines surrounding her at the moment, so it looks scarier than it actually is," the doctor responded, and then paused. "We don't know the extent of the damage, so we are just taking precautions. The wires and tubes attached to her are monitoring her organs. If there are other serious or life-threatening injuries to the rest of the body, they'll be dealt with in order of decreasing severity. I'm explaining this to you so you're prepared for when you see her." She gave Rebecca a faint smile. God, how many times a day does she repeat those lines? Rebecca wondered as she followed the doctor into the ICU. She held her breath as she walked through the ward, trying hard not to look at the dying and seriously ill patients, who looked as though their souls had already vacated their bodies, leaving nothing behind but shells. The silence of the ward was interrupted by the sound of the machines, continuous, deep, short, shunting breaths being pumped into the bodies of the unconscious from the ventilator. And then Rebecca's eyes were drawn to Genevieve, who looked like an Egyptian mummy preserved in time. She lay motionless, as still as silence. The doctor hadn't lied. There were tubes and wires coming from her blood-encrusted temples, arms, and hands. Her face was red and swollen, with a large bruise developing on one side. Her hands had so many tubes attached to them, they looked like someone had been using them for an atlas, and had stuck pins in to show where they had travelled. Each tube had a label indicating what medication was being fed into her body. Rebecca stood beside the bed and touched Genevieve's hand. It was surprisingly warm, but felt lifeless. There was no feeling in it, no response. She didn't know what to do with herself, whether to scream, cry, shout, or maybe rip the wires from Genevieve's body and carry her home and will her to wake up and relive the day again. Only this time she would not let her go. She would hold her forever. Did Genevieve see the person who attacked her? What was she thinking at that very moment? Did she think of me? Rebecca felt like she was dying inside. If this had to happen, she wished she could have been there, that she could have held her, stroked her hair the way she liked, held her hands in hers, told her she was there and she would never leave her, and that she loved her and everything was going to be all right. Did anyone comfort her, or did they just leave her lying on the floor, stunted by their own fear of how easily the path of life changes? Rebecca heard Genevieve's mother before she saw her. A low whining sound that was barely audible soon turned into a hysterical pitch that clawed at those who heard it, leaving imprints on their hearts. Her pain like a thick fog choking the room. Genevieve's parents were being comforted by a nurse as she cajoled them toward the bed, where their lifeless daughter lay. As they came nearer the bed, Rebecca could see the grief written in every line on Genevieve's mother's face. She was a short woman, her hair scraped back severely in a tight bun, her slender body shaking. "Oh God! Oh my God!" she wailed, tears dripping from her cheeks. Genevieve's father stood beside his wife. It took them a few minutes to acknowledge she was standing there, and the moment they did, the pure dread on their faces was replaced with pure hatred. Chapter 4. 4 years earlier. Rebecca and Genevieve spent their first weekend together in bed, laughing, talking, taking long, leisurely baths together, and revealing secrets only lovers did when they wanted to let each other in, when they wanted to connect. Genevieve had finally relented and explained the history between herself and Paul, but only after he had called her day and night, demanding to know where she was. Paul was a fellow artist whose passion was painting. If he could exist without sleeping and just paint, he would. It was this passion that had brought them together. She had been attracted to Paul as an artist, not a lover, but she'd been too young to know the difference. She had not really paid much attention to her sexuality, or what gender she was attracted to. To her, it was just about a meeting of the minds. Whilst travelling and taking photos, she had slept with a couple of women, nothing heavy, just a pleasurable release. She was not looking for a relationship per se, until she met Paul. What drove their relationship was the enthusiasm, the excitement, the energy, and how they conversed on the ideas generated about the art they were producing. Genevieve had never lied to herself about feeling any great passion towards the man. It was toward what he represented. Things had moved quickly between them. They were soon live-in lovers and inseparable. Most importantly, they appreciated each other's dedication to their given art. It wasn't long before Paul was introduced to her family, and he was an instant hit. Her parents were devout Catholics who were pleased she had made a union with someone of the same faith. They knew better than to try and force the issue about marriage with her, but on many occasions Paul would be in secret talks with her parents about making an honest woman of her, which was good enough for them. Life had drifted along for the first few years. They had settled into a familiar pattern of painting, galleries, art shows, and the like. One day, Genevieve had received an assignment to cover a trial in an African state. She'd grabbed the opportunity, and after getting back from Africa, her agent had touted her photographs around, and they had been a huge hit. An opportunity had arisen for her to showcase her photographs for a charity that she held close to her heart. It was called Children South East, and she and Paul had been donating their art to them for years. It was at a celebratory meal with her family and friends before her showcase that Paul had proposed marriage to her in a good old-fashioned way. He had asked her father for his blessing, he had the diamond ring, and he went down on one knee. Sitting there in total shock and looking at her parents' beaming faces, she'd had no choice but to say yes. She had truly been ambushed, and there was no way out. So she had played along and cried real tears, only they weren't tears of joy, but of sadness. It was in this happy, boisterous mood that the party of family and friends had made their way to the Ivy House Gallery. Genevieve had never been unfaithful to Paul, but she really hadn't been able to help herself this time. Well, she could have helped herself by not following Rebecca outside when she had seen her leaving, or going back to her apartment with her and seducing her before they'd even finished their first drink. But it was done now, and she had to face the music. The fact was that she'd left the gallery without even saying goodbye to her parents or Paul, and she had not left Rebecca's apartment for the entire weekend. She knew she was going to have to go home that evening, and she knew she was leaving him. She knew in her heart she should have left years ago, but she hadn't, and now she was going to have to deal with the consequences. "I think it's time I put some clothes on. I'm beginning to feel like a naturist," Genevieve said, smiling, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Rebecca knew Genevieve was starting to erect a barrier between them, but she didn't know why. "Have you any regrets, Genevieve?" she asked, bracing herself for the answer. "Yes," she replied, taking her face in her hands. "I regret that I didn't meet you years ago." She kissed Rebecca, then gathered her clothes together from the floor and made her way to the bathroom. The lights were out when she got home. Is this a ploy to make me think he isn't home? Now that she was no longer wrapped in the security of Rebecca's presence, The full force of what she had done came at her like a bolt of lightning. Fuck, what the fuck am I doing? She thought furiously. Was she like an uncontrollable teenager, unable to tame her natural instincts? But even as she thought this, she knew that there was more to what had happened with Rebecca than just sex. Had it been sex for the sake of it, she would not be longing to be back with her, looking at her, waking up with her. The physical attraction had been intense, and they had needed to satisfy that urge to see if there was anything worthwhile behind it. Both had known there would be, but had they not released the pent-up energy that had occurred from their first meeting, they probably would have exploded. She opened the front door and walked straight into the dark front room. She saw his silhouette on the sofa from the street lamp outside. "So you decided to come back," he slurred. He was drunk and holding the empty bottle of whiskey to his chest. Genevieve switched on the light. "I think it's best we talk when you're sober," she said, mildly annoyed. "Are you fucking joking?" he raged. "You stay out all weekend like a fucking alley cat in heat and have the gall to dictate to me when we can talk." He heaved himself onto his feet and stood towering over her, his face bright red, infused with a mixture of alcohol and anger. "Look, Paul," she said, refusing to cower to him, "you're drunk, and if you think you are going to get anywhere by behaving in a threatening manner toward me, you have another thing coming. When you are sober, I will discuss with you what we should have discussed a long time ago." "Oh, just fuck off, you fucking dyke." "Yes, that's right. Dyke. The whole fucking gallery was talking about you two. The famous dyke art lover and the starstruck artist. Have you any idea how fucking small you made me feel? Not to mention the humiliation of your parents hearing about their fucking pussy-loving dyke of a daughter." Up until then, Genevieve hadn't been affected by his torrent of abuse. He was hurt, so it was understandable, but the bit about her parents startled her. Did her parents really know, or was he just saying that to get back at her? He was still ranting, but she was no longer listening. She just had to get out of there. She ran into their bedroom, grabbed her overnight bag from the wardrobe, threw some clothes in it, and gathered together her toiletries. He didn't try to stop her from leaving. In fact, he opened the door for her and told her in no uncertain terms to get out. She decided to book into a hotel for a few days to give her time to think. She wanted to be with Rebecca, but this was her mess, and she didn't want to spoil what had been a perfect weekend with her emotional baggage. The hotel room was spacious and plush. A large flat-screen TV hung on the wall, and alcohol waited in crystal decanters on top of a marble dresser. The window overlooked landscaped gardens that would put even Kew Gardens to shame. She was grateful that she'd remained financially independent, otherwise God knows where she would have ended up tonight. She switched off her mobile phone. She didn't want to have to speak to anyone until she had made sense of what had happened in the last few days herself. She didn't feel able to talk to anyone about what had happened either. It was as if friends, with whom she could have spoken to about anything on Thursday, were not available in this new world of hers. All her friends were straight and had boyfriends or husbands, and no doubt Paul hadn't wasted any time informing them about what a deviant bitch she was. She called room service and ordered a bottle of chilled Chablis. After it had been delivered, she ran herself a hot bubble bath, filled her glass halfway, and slipped into the warm, soothing water. She sipped her wine and closed her eyes, with every intention of thinking her way out of the mess she had gotten herself into, but instead she thought about Rebecca. The following morning she knew something was amiss when she turned on her mobile phone and saw that she had 10 missed calls, and a computerized voice informed her that her voicemail was full. The first message was from her mum, sobbing down the phone, asking her if it was true. At that point, Genevieve knew that it wasn't just Paul being spiteful. Her parents had heard the gossip about her and Rebecca. She sat there with tears rolling down her face. Her parents were the last people on earth she wanted to hurt, and listening to the pain in her mother's voice went straight to her heart. Paul had left a message apologising for his behaviour the night before and asking to meet and talk. There were more messages from her mother, and one from her father demanding that she bloody call them and let them know what the hell she was playing at. Her father only used those words when he was seething, and she momentarily felt frightened. She was 26 years old, yet she felt like a defenceless 6-year-old and way out of her depth. She wouldn't lie to her parents, so the only question left was would they disown her? Her mother and father were an old-fashioned couple, so she didn't expect them to accept everything. But what she did expect was a little understanding, especially when it came to their own daughter's happiness. 2 days later, she still hadn't spoken to her parents, friends, or Rebecca. She had been feeling emotionally drained, but that morning she woke up ready to take on the world. She had made her decision and was going to follow through with it. It was her life, and if certain people didn't want to be a part of it, then so be it. She called the hotel reception and ordered a cab. 20 minutes later, she was sitting in her parents' front room, suffering the after-effects of admitting that what Paul had told them was true, that their engagement was off, and she had feelings for another woman. Her father was pacing the floor like a tiger ready to pounce. "I did not raise you to be an abomination to God," her father was yelling at the top of his voice, as though he was preaching a sermon. Her mother stood still, stunned and grief-stricken. She envisaged all the dreams she'd ever had for Genevieve, suddenly smashed beyond repair. "Please, Genevieve," her mum begged, "don't be brainwashed by these people. You're young, beautiful and gifted. They just want to suck the goodness out of you. I know you're a good girl, and you wouldn't be behaving like this under normal circumstances. It's this Rebecca, whatever her name is. She's messed with your head." She hadn't been expecting open arms, but this was too much even for her to bear. 4 days ago she'd been Miss Wonderful and couldn't put a foot wrong. And yet today she was an abomination because she was a lesbian. "What's this all about?" her father raged at her. "Can you tell me? 1 minute you're a normal girl getting married, and the next thing we know you're off being a deviant with God knows who. Homosexuality is the purest evil of the world, and you need to ask God to forgive your sick spirit. It's disgusting is what it is, and if you don't snap out of this, girlie, we'll have no more to do with you. Do you hear me?" "Loud and clear," Genevieve said, overwhelmed with sadness. She stood up with her dignity intact and walked out of her parents' house without looking back. Chapter 5. Present Day. Leaving Genevieve in the ICU with her parents was one of the hardest things Rebecca had ever faced. As much as she was hurting, she couldn't stay in the room with that much animosity. They hadn't exactly asked her to leave, but their body language had said it all, and with Rebecca having no legal rights, she thought it better not to push her luck too much, in case they banned her from seeing Genevieve at all. As she exited the unit, a man and woman dressed in matching dark suits headed toward her. "Miss Sheldon?" the man asked. He was handsome and athletic, and he knew it. The only negative she could see was his receding brown hair, which spoiled his otherwise perfect physical attributes. His partner was a slim woman with fair hair and fair skin and strikingly cold blue eyes. They knew who she was because the doctor she'd been talking to earlier obviously had pointed her out. "Yes," Rebecca replied, feeling slightly suspicious. "I'm DC Simpson, and this is my partner DC Smith from the Metropolitan Police Service. If it wouldn't be too much of an inconvenience, we'd like to talk to you about Miss Simmons." "Yes, of course," she said, following them to the room where she'd previously had a discussion with the doctor. Once they were all seated, DC Simpson took out his notepad and pen. "I'm sorry we have to do this now, but we need to piece together Miss Simmons' movements prior to her attack. I understand you share an apartment with her." How very diplomatic, Rebecca thought to herself, but all she said out loud was, "Yes, I do." "How long have you been living together?" he asked, not taking his eyes off her. "May I ask what relevance our living arrangements have?" She felt very disoriented and didn't understand what their personal life had to do with Genevieve being attacked. "I'm sorry if this sounds personal, but it's just procedure," he said, looking a little uncomfortable. His partner looked intently at Rebecca and interjected. Miss Sheldon, as you can appreciate, we are starting this case on a blank canvas, and we need to know everything we possibly can if we are going to find the perpetrator of this crime. I apologise in advance if the questions are too personal, but I'm sure you can appreciate that we are asking them through necessity, not curiosity. There was no mistaking the authoritative tone. Rebecca didn't know whether this was because D.C. Smith was passionate about her job, or merely didn't like Rebecca questioning her partner, but it made Rebecca feel uncomfortable. And I'm sure you can appreciate that my partner is lying in there in a coma and may die for all I know, so I apologise in advance if I'm still distressed and am not responding to your questions like a robot. She fired back at her, the anger and frustration of the day rising up within her. There was an awkward silence that Rebecca broke with an impatient sigh. We've been living together for 4 years, she said, directing this information at D.C. Simpson. He duly wrote it down in his notepad. Could you go through this morning's events and, if possible, fill us in with Miss Simmons' timetable for the day? Rebecca told him about their morning, although she omitted the information about their lovemaking. So there was nothing out of the ordinary today? He asked. No. And the artist whose exhibit she was attending tonight was a personal friend? He continued. Of Genevieve's, yes. Look, if there's anything else, I'll give you my number to contact me, but I really want to go back and see if there is any change. Rebecca could feel D.C. Smith glaring at her, as if she knew there was more to the story than she was letting on, but she'd be damned if she was going to sit here with this intimidating woman and reveal the intimate details of their betrayal of Paul. Both officers stood up. That'll be all for now, D.C. Simpson said, closing his notebook and slipping it into the side pocket of his jacket. Rebecca stood up, took her card out of her bag and handed it to him, completely ignoring D.C. Smith. Feeling somewhat remorseful, she said, I'm sorry if I haven't been that helpful, but if anything comes to mind, I will call you. I just don't know where my mind is at the moment. She left the room and its hostile atmosphere. Genevieve's parents were not at her bedside when Rebecca returned to the ward. The nurse informed her that they'd gone to speak to the doctor. Sitting down beside Genevieve, she took her hand in her own and stroked it gently as tears began to well in her eyes again. She spoke to her in a whisper. If this was a movie, you would wake up now, looking like you had just had a makeover and this nightmare would be over. I wouldn't have to sit here wondering if I will be burying you or caring for you. She rested her head on Genevieve's hand. She felt the presence of someone standing by the bed, and as she looked up, she immediately recognized him. It had been 4 years since she had seen Paul. He still looked the same, but his handsome features looked drawn, and his eyes were bloodshot, with dark circles beneath them. He stared down at Genevieve, not uttering a word to Rebecca, or even acknowledging she was there. He took Genevieve's hand in his and sobbed. Rebecca was at a loss. She didn't know whether to offer him words of comfort or let him know that she understood his pain. After all, he had also loved Genevieve once. Before she could do anything, she heard Genevieve's mother. Paul, oh Paul, thank God you're here, thank God! Paul turned around and embraced her tightly. Her father joined the hug, and Rebecca was left sitting there like an outsider. What happened to her? Paul asked as he released her parents from his grip. What the hell happened? We don't know all the facts yet, Paul, Genevieve's father responded. All we know is she was attacked. Well, they think it was a mugging, but the police haven't got much to go on. There apparently were no witnesses as far as they know. Will she be all right? Paul asked, turning round to look at Genevieve again. The doctor doesn't know. They can't know for sure until she wakes up and they can do tests on her, Genevieve's father said. If she wakes up, her mother wailed. Paul once again took her in his arms to comfort her. Oh, pull yourself together, Elsie, for God's sake, Genevieve's father said, struggling to hold his temper. She'll be fine, Elsie. Don't worry, she'll be fine, Paul responded sympathetically. I hope so, Paul, I hope so, she said, dabbing a tissue at her eyes whilst cowering at her husband's reproach. We've just got to have faith in the good Lord. He'll see her through it, her father said with confidence. It's good to have you back in the fold, son, he said, grabbing Paul's shoulder. The nurse entered and informed them there were too many visitors and someone would have to leave. For the first time since they had been playing Happy Family, they all turned and looked at Rebecca. She was determined not to make a scene, so she leant over and kissed Genevieve's forehead, aware that her movements were being watched by the family, but she didn't care. She gave Genevieve's hand a quick squeeze and left. Peter was waiting for Rebecca in reception at the entrance of the hospital. He sure was a sight for sore eyes, and she had never been so relieved to see him. His face was pale, but there was warmth and concern in his eyes, and for that she had never been more grateful. "Come here," he said, taking her in his arms. "How bad is it?" he asked after a few seconds. "Bad," was all she could say through her tears. She had to stop crying. Tears were not going to solve anything, and she had to be strong, not just for herself but for Genevieve as well. Whatever the outcome, she just had to deal with it. She released herself from the warmth and security of Peter's arms. "And to top it all off," she continued, "Paul is up there with her parents, acting like they are the Brady Bunch." "Paul?" he asked dubiously. "What's he doing back on the scene?" "Quite a lot, by the look of it. God, the way they are behaving, it's as if he is their long-lost son and I'm the invisible woman." "I take it you being there wasn't on their wish list." "Peter, they shunned me like I was a leprosy victim. Paul only acknowledged me when they all ejected me out of the ward with their eyes." Peter was starting to feel angry and resentful. He'd heard of stories like these, where the parents of gay couples lorded it over their partners when emergency situations arose. Instead of respecting their children's wishes, knowing that they would want their partners treated with respect and full involvement with any decisions that were made, they were banished to the sidelines instead. Whether it was a power play or just plain disgusting ignorance, he didn't care. He just wanted to go up to that ward and tell them exactly what he thought. He was a witness to the great love both women shared. Their love had hurt no one. Standing there in the hospital reception with Rebecca, while Genevieve was upstairs, made his heart ache. "Come on, I'll take you home and make you one of my famous toddies." He took Rebecca by the arm and led her to the car park. After drinking several of Peter's whiskey concoctions, sleep had come easily to Rebecca. For those few hours that she slept, she dreamt of clear visions of Genevieve, who was conscious and her usual vivacious self. She awoke smiling and was just about to tell Genevieve about the weird dream she'd just had, when reality kicked in, and the enormity of the situation hit her. She lay there for a few minutes, letting her thoughts run randomly through her head, then sat up briskly with the intention of getting things in order. She was grateful it was a Saturday. She'd have more time to organise things. It would be better to email work and do a follow-up call on Monday, when she had more information to go on. Next on the list was to cancel all of their joint and singular dinner dates and appointments. She knew it was a bit impersonal, but decided to email their friends about what had happened rather than phone everyone. She just didn't have the emotional strength to answer all the questions, and knew they would understand and wouldn't be offended. Before all that, she needed a shower and a strong cup of tea. Then she would pack an overnight bag for Genevieve. She picked up Genevieve's pyjamas, which she always left folded under her pillow, and put them to her face, breathing in her scent. She willed herself to get out of bed, and then literally ran to the shower, knowing if she didn't get off the bed now, she would just stay there and wither away. At 6 a.m. she took a cab to the hospital, not wanting to wake Peter by phoning him. He'd stayed with her until the early hours, only leaving when he could see that she could no longer keep her eyes open. She made her way to the ICU and was relieved that it was relatively quiet at that time of the morning. She rang the bell and was buzzed in. She was flooded with relief when she saw that Genevieve was by herself. The parents and Paul were nowhere to be seen. Genevieve looked exactly the same as the day before, but had obviously been bathed. New pyjamas had replaced the standard nightwear the hospital gave their parents. Rebecca smiled as she thought of what Genevieve would say when she woke up and saw what she was wearing. She was not a clothes snob, but there was only so far you could push a girl. Rebecca kissed her warm cheek and held her hand. "I'm here," she said to her. "I'm here, baby." She touched her cheek with the back of her hand and watched her, content just to be there, even under such circumstances. She read the doctor's notes on the clipboard at the bottom of the bed, and was relieved to see that nothing major had happened during the night, and that all vital organs were in working order. Other than that, she couldn't understand the medical jargon regarding the medications they were giving her. She enjoyed the precious few hours she had with her before Genevieve's parents arrived. They were in a more subdued mood, but they still ignored her. "I brought a bag with items she might need when she wakes up," Rebecca said to Genevieve's mother. "You shouldn't have bothered," her father spat. "We have everything she needs." Genevieve's mother didn't even look at her. Rebecca remained silent. "Judging by those pyjamas, you might have what she needs, but certainly not what she'd want," she thought to herself. She decided to not antagonize them by attempting to make conversation. They had made it very clear that they would tolerate her at the bedside for a limited amount of time, and that was about it. Even for that crumb, Rebecca was grateful. She was well aware they could stop her visits if they wanted to, and she would have no recourse in the matter. How she could kick herself when she thought back to the many times they both shunned the idea of a civil partnership, never dreaming for 1 minute that a time like this would come. If Genevieve made it through this nightmare, her first day out of hospital would be spent at the registry office with Rebecca. She would make sure that neither of them would ever have to go through this again. At midday, Paul arrived at the hospital looking worse than the day before. Rebecca smelt the odour of alcohol as he walked straight past her. Before the nurse had the opportunity to tell them about the number of visitors allowed, Rebecca squeezed Genevieve's hand, said goodbye to her, and left. She had never felt so alone. For the next week, the routine was the same every day, only Rebecca now started going to the hospital at midnight, having been told in confidence by an on-duty nurse that that was the time the family usually left the hospital. She always left when Paul arrived at midday. She couldn't believe how badly he seemed to be taking it. Each time she saw him, he looked unkempt and smelt of alcohol. In the midst of her own despair, she felt for him. She knew that he had loved Genevieve, and had been heartbroken when she had called off their engagement. Not only did he lose his fiancée, but he also lost his best friend. She had heard through the grapevine on many occasions throughout the years that he was still pining for Genevieve. But for the last year they had heard nothing until the invitation had arrived on that fateful day. Though both women were apprehensive, Genevieve had thought it best that she attend his show, not only for the support he would need, but also to try and mend the broken bridge between them. Fate, however, had had other ideas. When Rebecca walked into her apartment, the answering machine was blipping. She pressed the play button and went to hang her coat up in the cloakroom. She just caught the tail end of the message from her boss, Clifford Stokes. "I know that asking you to do this under the current circumstances is insensitive, but you are the only person I can trust with such a project. I will understand if you say no, but please think about it. A couple of days in Paris, and if need be, you can be back in London within a few hours by plane." This was followed by messages from friends asking for updates on Genevieve. Rebecca had advised their friends not to go to the hospital, and they were all too aware of Genevieve's parents' attitudes towards Rebecca. Rebecca mulled it over in her mind whether to go to Paris and do the art review. Clifford had been so good to her over the years, and he had rarely asked for any favours of her. "It must be important to him if he's asking me under these circumstances," she said to herself thoughtfully as she picked up the phone and dialed his number. She was booked on the 7:15 p.m. flight to Paris that same day. She packed selectively, retrieved her passport from the safe, and made her way down to the lobby to wait for Peter to pick her up. She hadn't seen Peter since the first day Genevieve was in hospital. There was no point in him driving her to the hospital every day, because Genevieve's parents would not let him see her. They had begrudgingly let Rebecca see her, and other than themselves and Paul, they had refused to let anybody else visit. He held her tightly when she made her way to the car. "How are you holding up?" he asked, holding her at arm's length. "Better than I should be," she replied. Peter noticed the dark circles underneath her eyes, and the way her veins bulged from beneath her skin, because she had lost so much weight. She had been slim before this trauma, but now she looked like a skeleton. He was convinced that she wasn't eating, and made a promise to himself that when she returned from Paris he would take care of her. She had been shutting him and her friends out during a time when she needed them most. He put her case in the boot, and was pleased that she had left herself into the passenger seat rather than the back seat. On the way to the airport, he queried her on how Genevieve was progressing. Sensing her unease about the subject, he changed it to her upcoming trip. The flight to Paris was uneventful. Even the turbulence, which under normal circumstances would have her reaching for the brandy, had no effect on her. As she entered the arrival area of the Paris airport, she spotted a stocky, well-built chauffeur, holding a placard with her name on it. "Bonjour, madame," he said in a thick Parisian accent. "Bonjour," she replied, handing over her luggage. He guided her through the airport to where he had parked the car. As soon as she was alone in her hotel room, she called the hospital in London to see if there had been any change in Genevieve's condition. Disheartened, she replaced the receiver. There had been no change. It had been 9 days since she had slipped into a coma, but it felt like a lifetime to Rebecca. She unpacked her case and helped herself to the ice-cold champagne, which had been waiting for her arrival in a silver ice bucket, compliments from Clifford, as well as a massive bouquet of flowers. "He's such a sweetheart," she thought, as she inhaled the fragrance from the flowers. There was a package on the desk with her name written on the front. She opened it to find a ticket for the upcoming show she was to attend, and some general information about the artists whose work she would be reviewing. She was sorry that she could not muster up the slightest bit of enthusiasm for the show or the artists. All she could think about was Genevieve. She knew she had to get into her work mode if she was going to do the artists any justice. Not only that, Clifford was relying on her to produce a very high-quality piece of work. After her second glass of champagne, she began to wonder if she had done the right thing, going on a trip when she should have been at Genevieve's bedside. By her fourth glass of champagne, her emotions and fears had been replaced with a false bravado. Everything was going to turn out okay, so there was no need to worry. She unpacked her laptop, switched it on, waited for the internet to connect, and began her initial background research on the artists. The following evening, a fellow British critic named Oscar escorted Rebecca to the show. He was a flamboyant and witty elderly man, and being in his company was just what she needed. He talked non-stop, which was a relief to Rebecca because she was not up for making conversation. He told witty anecdotes, dirty jokes, and was very knowledgeable about the art world. Thankfully, the critics only got to spend a few minutes with each of the artists, and were then handed a carefully written marketing piece about them, which was fine as far as Rebecca was concerned, but it was their art she was interested in. After seeing each piece, she asked the relevant questions that she needed answers to in order to enable her to write an honest review. The hours whizzed past, and she was more than relieved when the evening was over. She bade Oscar good night over his pleas for her to have a nightcap with him, and made her way to her room. Her phone light was flashing, and she hurriedly dialed the number to listen to her voicemail. There was one message, and it was from the hospital. Her heart nearly exploded through her body. The words she would have sold her soul to hear sounded in her earpiece. Genevieve was awake.